Welcome to Voices of the Case. In this episode, we want to tell you the story of O.J. Simpson, the trial that obsessed America.
It really did. A tale of a fallen hero, a truly brutal crime, and, well, a legal battle that just exposed so many fault lines in the nation.
It started June 12th, 1994, and it just plunged this glittering world of celebrity, success straight into darkness.
Yeah, what seemed like it might be a straightforward investigation, at least at first, it unraveled, became this incredibly complex tapestry of evidence, doubt, and intense public fascination.
Let's just set the scene a bit. Orenthal James Simpson. O.J., a football legend.
Yeah.
Then an actor, super charismatic.
Yeah.
Just part of American culture.
Absolutely woven into the fabric. And then silence, followed by this really chilling discovery in the early hours of June 13th.
Tell us about that discovery.
Around 12:10 a.m., the bodies of Nicole Brown Simpson, his ex-wife, and her friend Ronald Goldman. They were found outside Nicole's place on Bundy Drive in Brentwood.
A horrific scene, I understand.
Horrific. Nicole had been stabbed multiple times, head, neck, defensive wounds. Clearly she fought back.
And Goldman.
Goldman, too. Stabbed repeatedly. It looked like he just stumbled into it. Wrong place, wrong time, maybe trying to help.
And they had an idea of when it happened.
The estimate was maybe around 2 hours before they were found, so sometime around 10:30 that night.
And right away, the police start finding things.
Yeah, those initial hours were crucial. Officer Robert Risk, first on the scene, he noticed a single bloody glove.
Just one glove.
One glove, and a dark wool cap near the bodies. That cap, initially there was some speculation it might belong to O.J.'s son, Jason, but that didn't really pan out.
So the glove is the main thing there.
At the scene, yes. And that leads them pretty quickly to Simpson's own estate over on Rockingham.
And what do they find there?
Another really unsettling discovery, a white Ford Bronco parked kind of askew, and it had blood on it.
Blood on the outside. Inside.
Stains were visible, and this leads to a pretty significant decision by the police right then.
Which what?
They decided to go onto Simpson's property without a warrant.
Wow, okay. How could they do that?
They cited exigent circumstances. Basically, they argued they feared Simpson himself might be injured, maybe another victim inside. A justification that would be debated later, of course.
Of course. So they go in. Is Simpson there?
No, he's gone. Already on a red-eye flight to Chicago for a planned event.
But they find someone.
They find Cato Kalin, who was living in the guest house. They talked to him briefly. And then Detective Mark Furman makes another discovery.
Don't tell me.
The second bloody glove.
The matching glove.
The mate to the one found at the Bundy crime scene. Found on a pathway behind the guest house on Simpson's property.
That's huge.
Absolutely huge. And later tests, DNA tests, showed blood from both Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman on that glove.
So you've got a glove at the crime scene, its mate at Simpson's house, both with victim DNA.
Exactly. That formed the core of the probable cause. It led directly to the arrest warrant being issued for O.J. Simpson. The hero athlete, the movie star, now a murder suspect.
The stage was set for his arrest. But what actually happened? Well, it wasn't a quiet surrender, was it?
Not even close. It became this spectacle that just completely gripped the nation. A slow-motion drama played out live on TV.
So there was an agreement first.
Yeah.
For him to turn himself in.
Yes, initially. The plan was for Simpson to surrender on June 17th at 11 a.m. His lawyer, Robert Shapiro, had negotiated it.
But 11 a.m. comes and goes.
And no Simpson. Shapiro's looking panicked. The police are waiting. By the afternoon, the LAPD officially declared him a fugitive.
And then things got even weirder.
Oh, yeah. Robert Kardashian, Simpson's longtime friend, looking absolutely stunned, steps up to the microphones and reads this letter from O.J.
The alleged suicide note.
It certainly sounded like one to many people. Lines like, "Don't feel sorry for me, I've had a great life," and crucially, "First, everyone understand I had nothing to do with Nicole's murder." But the overall tone felt like a goodbye.
So now it's a manhunt, basically. Very public one.
A desperate manhunt.
Yeah.
Everyone's on edge. And then, around 6:20 p.m., a motorist spots the white Ford Bronco.
The same one from his house.
The very same one, down in Orange County, heading north on the freeway. But Simpson wasn't driving.
Who was?
His friend and former teammate, Al Callings, known as E.C. Simpson, was in the back, reportedly holding a gun.
To his own head.
That's what Callings told the police over the phone. "He's got a gun to his head," he said. "He just wants to see his mother."
And this triggers the chase.
The infamous Bronco chase, though chase is maybe the wrong word. It was incredibly slow. like 35 miles per hour sometimes.
But the police were right there.
Oh yeah, a whole convoy, up to 20 police cars, lights flashing, and helicopters overhead, news helicopters, broadcasting the entire thing live.
I remember this. They broke into everything. Regular programming just stopped.
Everything stopped, an estimated 95 million people watching. NBC even famously used a split screen showing the chase alongside the NBA Finals game.
That's unbelievable, and people were supporting him.
Crowds actually gathered on freeway overpasses, holding signs, "Go, OJ, go!" It was surreal. A bizarre mix of celebrity worship, morbid curiosity, and this unfolding potential tragedy.
Were police talking to him during this?
They were trying. His former USC coach, John McKay, pleaded with him over the phone. Detective Tom Lange, who'd interviewed him just after the murders were discovered, got on the line too.
What did Lange say?
You can hear the recordings. Lange is trying to talk him down, reminding him about his children, about Nicole, urging him to throw the gun out the window.
Did anyone else weigh in?
Well, Al Michaels, the sportscaster who knew Simpson, was on air for ABC commenting on it. He basically said he felt Simpson's actions, running like this, looked like an admission of guilt.
How did it finally end?
After about 50 miles, incredibly slowly, the Bronco finally pulled back into Simpson's Brentwood estate, around 8 p.m.
And he surrendered then?
Not immediately. As the Bronco arrived, his son Jason was actually seen running from the house. Another strange detail. Then there was this tense 45-minute standoff. Simpson stayed in the Bronco.
What was he asking for?
He apparently wanted to talk to his mother. He was allowed to go inside the house briefly, supposedly had a glass of orange juice. But the surrender didn't happen until Robert Shapiro finally arrived on the scene.
And then he gave himself up.
Then he finally came out and surrendered to the police.
And the things they found inside that Bronco. Quite telling, weren't they?
Extremely telling. About $8,000 in cash, a change of clothes, a loaded .357 Magnum pistol, his passport, family photos, and perhaps most bizarrely, a disguise kit, a fake goatee and mustache, plus makeup adhesive.
Wow. That screams getaway plan.
It certainly looks that way, but here's a crucial point for later. None of it, not the chase footage, not the gun, the cash, the disguise, none of that was ever shown to the jury in the criminal trial.
Really? Why not?
The judge ruled it was potentially more prejudicial than probative, that it might unfairly bias the jury against Simpson, separate from the actual murder evidence.
Okay, so the chase ends, he's arrested. What happens next, legally?
The legal wheels start turning fast. June 20th, he's formally arraigned, pleads not guilty.
Then bail.
No bail, held in custody. The judge ruled the circumstances. Double homicide warranted it.
Was there a grand jury?
Initially, yes. One was convened. But it was dismissed just a few days later, around June 23rd.
Why dismiss it?
Because the media coverage was already absolutely overwhelming. There were serious concerns that the grand jurors had been exposed to too much potentially prejudicial information, that they couldn't be impartial.
So no indictment from a grand jury?
Correct. This led to a preliminary hearing instead, sometimes called a probable cause hearing.
What's the difference?
It's basically a mini trial in front of a judge, not a jury, where the prosecution presents evidence to show there's enough probable cause to hold the defendant for trial. It also gives the defense a chance to see the prosecution's evidence and cross-examine witnesses early on.
Were there any key witnesses at this stage who didn't make it to the main trial?
Yes, two notable ones. Jill Shavely, who claimed she saw a white Bronco speeding away from the Bundy area around the time of the murders.
And the other?
Jose Camacho. He worked at a cutlery store and told the grand jury he'd sold Simpson a long 15-inch stiletto knife, similar to what might have been the murder weapon just weeks before.
That sounds like powerful testimony. Why wasn't it used later?
Because both Shively and the cutlery store employees apparently sold their stories to the tabloid press, Shively to hard copy, the store guys too. That destroyed their credibility for the prosecutors. They couldn't risk putting witnesses on the stand whose motives were so clearly financial.
So the preliminary hearing goes ahead without them.
Right. And it was seen as something of a minor victory for the defense because it gave them early access to the prosecution's case. But ultimately, on July 7th, Judge Kathleen Kennedy Powell ruled that yes, there was sufficient evidence, enough probable cause to proceed to trial.
And Simpson pleads again.
At his second arraignment, July 22nd, this time, very emphatically, he stood up and said, absolutely, 100% not guilty.
So the trial is set. Where does it actually happen?
Not in Santa Monica, which was geographically closer to Brentwood. It was moved downtown to the main Los Angeles Criminal Courts building.
Why the move?
Primarily security concerns. The Santa Monica courthouse was smaller, harder to secure with the kind of media frenzy and public interest this case was generating. But that move had a really significant side effect.
Which was?
It changed the potential jury pool. Downtown LA draws from a much more racially and socioeconomically diverse population compared to the wealthier, whiter West Side communities around Santa Monica. This demographic shift would become hugely important later.
Okay. And who were the key players in the courtroom?
The judge was Lance Arto, the lead prosecutor, Marcia Clark, along with Christopher Darden as co-prosecutor. Detective Tom Lange was the lead investigator presenting much of the police work.
And the prosecution made a big decision early on, right?
Yes, they decided not to seek the death penalty against Simpson.
Then came jury selection. That must have been intense.
Incredibly intense and lengthy. They started with a huge pool. Judge Ito ended up personally interviewing 304 potential jurors. They filled out massive questionnaires. Finally, on November 3rd, 1994, they seated 12 jurors and, crucially, 12 alternates.
12 alternates, that's a lot.
Yeah, anticipating it would be a long trial and they might lose jurors along the way, which they definitely did.
And when did the trial actually start?
Opening statements began January 24th, 1995, and it was televised, gavel-to-gavel coverage, mainly on court TV. It ran for 134 days. It just took over television.
Let's talk about that jury. What was the final makeup?
The final seated jury was 9 black jurors, 2 white jurors, and 1 Hispanic juror, and 10 women, 2 men.
That's a very specific demographic. Was that by design?
Well, both sides had theories. The prosecution, particularly Marcia Clark, initially felt women might be more sympathetic to the domestic violence evidence they planned to introduce. They thought maybe female jurors would identify with Nicole.
And the defense?
The defense, led by Johnny Cochran, might have felt that perhaps black jurors, particularly women, might be more skeptical of the LAPD, given historical context, and maybe less responsive to Marcia Clark's style. It's complex, and race was undeniably a factor from the start.
You mentioned alternates. Did they need them?
Oh, absolutely. The jury was sequestered for months, living in a hotel, cut off from media. It took a huge toll. Only 4 of the original 12 jurors actually made it to the final verdict. There was high attrition.
Any particular incidents with the jury?
There was one famous moment, kind of a mid-trial revolt. 13 jurors, originals, and alternates mixed by then apparently refused to come into the courtroom one morning. They wore dark clothing in protest, demanding a meeting with Judge Ito about the deputies guarding them and the conditions. Things were tense.
Wow. Okay, so the trial begins, prosecution goes first. What's their main argument?
Christopher Darden gave the opening. Their core argument was motive. Simpson murdered Nicole in a jealous rage, fueled by obsession and control after their separation.
How did they establish that?
They started by playing that chilling 911 call from 1989. You hear Nicole sounding terrified, saying Simpson had broken down her door. You can even hear him yelling furiously in the background. They presented photos of her bruised face from that incident and other evidence of past domestic violence.
Trying to paint a picture of ongoing abuse.
Exactly, showing a pattern of behavior. They also heavily relied on forensic evidence, DNA, blood analysis, shoe prints, arguing it physically placed Simpson at the crime scene.
Did the defense push back on the abuse evidence?
Oh, yes. Alan Dershowitz, part of the defense team, argued, quite controversially, that statistically, most abused women are not murdered by their partners, trying to dilute the impact of that history.
What was the prosecution's timeline for the crime itself?
They laid out a specific theory. Simpson drove his Bronco to Nicole's condo on Bundy. He attacked her, likely as she answered the door. Goldman arrived, maybe during or right after, and was then attacked and killed. They talked about a trail of blood leading away from the scene.
Blood they linked to Simpson?
Yes. They pointed to blood drops found outside Nicole's condo, and crucially, 3 drops found near the gate of Simpson's own Rockingham estate, which DNA suggested was his.
What was the time frame they gave him to do this?
This was key. They established Simpson was last seen publicly around 9:36 p.m. that night, chatting with Cato Kalin after getting burgers. He wasn't seen again until about 10:54 p.m., when the limo driver saw him emerge from the house to leave for the airport.
And the murders happened when?
The coroner estimated the time of death between roughly 10:15 and 10:40 p.m., so the prosecution argued that window, about an hour and 20 minutes, was enough time for Simpson to drive to Bundy, commit the murders, ditch evidence, and get back home.
Did they have witnesses placing him near Bundy?
They had that one witness, Jill Shovely, who saw the Bronco speeding away around 10:35 p.m., but remember, she was compromised. They couldn't use her. They relied more on inference and other testimonies.
Like the limo driver, Ellen Park.
Yes, Alan Park's testimony was critical. He arrived at Simpson's Rockingham estate at 10:04 p.m. to take him to the airport. He testified he buzzed the intercom repeatedly but got no answer. And significantly, he didn't see the white Bronco parked outside on the street where Simpson usually left it.
Implying it wasn't there at 10:24.
That was the prosecution's implication. If Simpson had been home, why didn't he answer? And where was the Bronco, if not used in the crime?
What about Cato Kalin's testimony around that time?
Kalin testified he was on the phone in his guest house around 10:50 p.m. when he heard 3 loud thumps on his back wall. It startled him. He went outside eventually and saw Park's limo out front.
And then Simpson appears.
According to Park, just before 11 p.m., he saw a shadowy figure, similar in build to Simpson, walk quickly across the lawn and enter the main house. Moments later, lights flicked on, and Simpson finally answered the intercom saying he'd overslept and would be right down.
Claiming he was asleep the whole time.
That was his explanation. But both Kalin and Park testified that Simpson seemed agitated and hurried when he finally came out to the limo. Although, other witnesses, later the ticket agent, flight attendants described him as seeming perfectly normal on the flight to Chicago.
What was the defense explanation for the thumps Kalin heard?
The defense suggested Simpson was maybe outside practicing his golf swing, hitting balls against the wall, or maybe dropped something. They tried to present an alibi witness, Rosa Lopez, a housekeeper for Simpson's neighbor, who claimed she saw the Bronco parked at Rockingham late that night.
Did that work?
Not really. Her testimony was videotaped because she planned to leave the country, but it was full of inconsistencies and contradictions about times. The prosecution tore it apart, and ultimately the defense chose not to even show the tape to the jury. It was too unreliable.
The defense also questioned if Simpson was physically capable, right?
Yes, they argued his old football injuries, his arthritis, would make it impossible for him to overpower 2 younger people, especially Goldman, and inflict those kinds of brutal injuries.
How did the prosecution counter that?
They played excerpts from a fitness video Simpson had made not long before, showing him doing strenuous exercises. Sort of an, oh really, he can't handle it moment.
There was also testimony from the Cross family.
Very emotional testimony. Her sister, Denise Brown, tearfully recounted specific instances of past abuse she'd witnessed, Simpson throwing Nicole against a wall, being possessive and controlling.
And they traced Goldman's movements that night.
Yes. Testimony established Nicole's mother had called the restaurant Mezzaluna where Goldman worked and Nicole had eaten earlier, looking for her lost glasses. Goldman found them and volunteered to drop them off at Nicole's condo after his shift. He clocked out around 9:50 p.m.
Setting up his arrival at Bundy. What about sounds around the time of the murder?
Several neighbors testified. Pablo Fenjaves heard the plaintive wail of a dog, likely Nicole's Akita, starting around 10:10 or 10:15 p.m. Eva Stein heard persistent barking around the same time.
And the dog is what led to the discovery.
Essentially, yes. Around 11:30 p.m., Stephen Schwab found Nicole's Akita, agitated, barking with bloody paws. He took it home, then later walked it with a neighbor, Sukru Boztepe. The dog kept pulling them towards Nicole's condo.
And that's when Boztepe found them.
Boztepe followed the dog's lead, saw the gate open, looked inside, and saw Nicole's body at the bottom of the steps around midnight. He flagged down a passing police car.
Which brings us back to Officer Risk arriving.
Right. Risk's initial testimony described the scene. Nicole's body, Goldman nearby, the white envelope with the glasses, Goldman's pager, the single black leather glove, the dark ski cap. He noted the front door was open, no sign of forced entry.
Did the jury get to see the locations?
Yes. In February 1995, there was a highly publicized visit. The judge, jury, prosecution, defense, they all toured the Bundy crime scene and Simpson's Rockingham estate to get a sense of the layout and distances.
And the police notification to Simpson himself?
Detective Ron Phillips testified about calling Simpson in his Chicago hotel room early the next morning to inform him of Nicole's death. Phillips noted Simpson seemed upset, but crucially never asked how she had died, something the prosecution highlighted as suspicious.
Did investigators have a theory on the order of the attacks?
Detective Tom Lange theorized Nicole was likely attacked first. His reasoning was her bare feet were relatively clean, suggesting she hadn't run through the bloody crime scene after Goldman was attacked.
Did Cochran offer other possibilities during cross-examination?
Absolutely. Cochran floated alternative theories, maybe Colombian drug dealers targeting Nicole's friend Faye Resnick, who had known drug issues, were the real culprits. Or maybe Goldman was the target of assassins for some unknown reason, trying to create reasonable doubt.
Let's shift to the defense strategy, the famous Dream Team.
An unprecedented lineup of legal talent: Johnny Cochran, Robert Shapiro, F. Lee Bailey, Alan Dershowitz, Robert Kardashian, and importantly, DNA experts Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld from the Innocence Project.
Why were Scheck and Neufeld so critical?
Because the prosecution's case relied heavily on DNA evidence. The defense strategy wasn't just denying Simpson did it, it was attacking the evidence itself. Their core argument became, Simpson was framed by racist cops, and the forensic evidence was hopelessly contaminated and mishandled by incompetent LAPD personnel.
A very aggressive strategy. And expensive.
Hugely expensive. Estimates range from $3 million to $6 million, all paid by Simpson. A fortune even then.
And they focused heavily on Detective Furman.
Mark Furman became central to their claim of a frame-up. They contended he was a racist who hated Simpson and had the motive and opportunity to plant the bloody glove at Rockingham.
Did they try to bring Faye Resnick's alleged drug debts into it?
They tried. They wanted to suggest maybe the murders were related to drug dealers looking for Resnick, who had stayed at Nicole's condo, but Judge Ito shut that down. He ruled there was no direct or even circumstantial evidence linking Resnick's issues to the murder, so it was inadmissible speculation.
Okay, let's break down the key evidence presented to the jury. What did they hear about?
A lot of forensic detail. DNA from blood found on Simpson's socks in his bedroom matched Nicole's blood. The odds were astronomical, 1 in 9.7 billion, later refined to 1 in 21 billion.
How did the defense counter that?
Scheck and Dr. Henry Lee, a famed defense forensic expert, suggested potential contamination. Dr. Lee famously testified about something looking like a smear or impression on the sock, not just spatter, and questioned collection methods. He also noted a small hole near Simpson's ankle in photos taken later, though its relevance was debated.
What about the Bronco?
Blood analysis found DNA consistent with Simpson, Brown, and Goldman in and around the Bronco, evidence linking all three to that vehicle.
Hairs and fibers.
Yes, hair consistent with Simpson's found on Goldman's shirt. More fibers matching the Bronco's carpet found in that dark wool cap from the crime scene, along with African-American hair characteristics. Dark blue cotton fibers found on Goldman's body, which the prosecution linked to a sweatshirt Simpson potentially wore.
And the gloves.
The jury heard the left glove from Bundy and the right glove from Rockingham were a match the same pair. And crucially, DNA analysis on the Bundy glove showed a mixture consistent with Simpson, Brown, and Goldman.
But the defense had issues with the blood evidence collection.
Big time.
Yeah.
They hammered LAPD criminalist Dennis Fung on the stand about his procedures, getting him to admit he'd missed seeing some blood drops initially and hadn't always used gloves properly. They also raised questions about a vial of Simpson's reference blood drawn after his arrest. About 1.5 milliliters seemed to be missing, suggesting it could have been taken to plant evidence.
What was the prosecution's response to the missing blood?
They brought in FBI experts who testified that the amount wasn't precisely measured initially, and some blood naturally adheres to vials and testing equipment. They tried to show it wasn't sinister.
What about Furman's role in finding evidence?
This was huge. Furman found the bloody glove at Rockingham and pointed out blood smears near the Bronco. The defense argued he planted the glove. Then came the bombshell tapes proving he'd lied under oath about using racial slurs. When recalled, he pleaded the Fifth Amendment when asked directly, "Did you plant evidence in this case?" That was devastating for the prosecution.
Did the defense suggest anyone else might have planted evidence?
Dershowitz later floated a theory based on the presence of the preservative EDTA found in some bloodstains, including on the socks and a back gate, that maybe Detective Philip Vaneter carried the vial of Simpson's reference blood back to the crime scene before lodging it as evidence and planted that blood.
EDTA, the stuff in the purple top tubes.
Exactly. But the FBI expert testified the levels found were incredibly low, possibly from environmental sources or testing artifacts, and not conclusive proof of planting from the vial. It was complex and confusing for the jury.
And the shoes. The Bruno Magli shoes.
An FBI expert, William Bodziak, testified the bloody shoe prints at Bundy were made by distinctive, expensive Bruno Magli shoes, size 12 Simpson size. Only a small percentage of the population wore that size and style.
Did they prove Simpson owned a pair?
Initially, no. Simpson denied owning those ugly-ass shoes, as he reportedly called them. But then, months into the trial, freelance photographer Harry Skull produced photos he'd taken of Simpson at a football game months before the murders, seemingly wearing the exact style of Bruno Magli's shoes. The defense claimed the photos were doctored.
So lots of evidence presented. What was kept out? What did the jury not hear?
Significant amount. Remember the knife receipt from Jose Camacho? Out because he sold his story.
Right. What else?
Jill Shively's testimony about the speeding Bronco? Out. Same reason. Nicole Brown reportedly called a battered women's shelter just 4 days before she was killed, saying she was scared that Simpson was stalking her. That was ruled inadmissible hearsay, even though friends corroborated her fear.
Any other alleged confessions or statements?
There was a jail guard, Jeff Stewart, who claimed he overheard Simpson tell Minister Rosie Greer, "I didn't mean to do it," and Greer urged him to confess. Again, excluded as hearsay.
At the Bronco, chase details.
As we mentioned, the chase itself, the items found inside the Bronco, the gun, cash, disguise, all excluded. Simpson's suicide note, read by Kardashian, also out. Even his initial statements to police were largely kept from the jury.
Anything else surprising?
Simpson had done some training for a TV pilot called Frogmen involving knife handling. There was even a scene of him holding a knife to a woman's throat in a movie. The prosecution wanted to show it, but Judge Ito ruled it irrelevant and prejudicial. And Rosa Lopez's shaky alibi testimony was never played.
So the jury got a very filtered version of events.
Absolutely. Both sides fought hard over every piece of evidence.
Let's dig into the DNA specifically.
Yeah.
How reliable was it considered then?
DNA evidence was still relatively new in courtrooms. Initial tests, PCR, weren't as precise, but didn't exclude Simpson. Later, more discriminating RFLP testing showed matches between Simpson's blood and blood found at the crime scene on those shoe prints, the back gate.
And Vung testified to this.
Yes, Dennis Fung testified the DNA placed Simpson at Nicole's house. But Barry Scheck's cross-examination of Fung, and later the lab analysts like Dr. Robin Cotton from Silmark Diagnostics, was relentless. Scheck poked holes in collection procedures, documentation, potential contamination.
What kind of contamination risks?
They highlighted Fung not changing gloves enough, mishandling swatches. They focused on a police criminalist, Andrea Mazzola, who admitted carrying the vial of Simpson's reference blood in her lab coat pocket for hours before logging it in, suggesting possible cross-contamination with evidence collected later. They also brought up past proficiency testing errors by Silmark, though it turned out a lab the defense consulted had made similar errors.
Did the defense ever test the DNA themselves?
That's a key point. The prosecution offered the defense the chance to split the remaining DNA samples and conduct their own independent tests. The defense declined that offer.
Why decline?
Scheck argued they didn't trust the samples weren't already contaminated, but the prosecution suggested it was because they knew the tests would likely confirm the matches. And late in the trial, analyst Gary Sims testified that the glove found at Rockingham tested positive for Goldman's blood too, linking it directly back.
Now Mark Furman again. His testimony and the tapes. How did that unfold?
Furman testified early on about finding the glove at Rockingham, scaling the wall, seeing blood near the Bronco. During cross-examination by F. Lee Bailey, he was asked point blank if he'd used the N-word in the past 10 years. He denied it emphatically, repeatedly, said anyone who claimed he had was lying.
But the defense had proof otherwise.
They did. They had unearthed audio tapes of Furman being interviewed by a screenwriter named Laura McKinney years earlier. On these tapes, Furman used the N-word dozens of times, 41 times reportedly. He also boasted about police brutality, manufacturing evidence, and his hatred for interracial couples.
How did they get those tapes admitted?
It was a huge legal battle. Judge Ito allowed only a couple of short snippets to be played for the jury, specifically showing Furman using the slur within the 10-year time frame he denied, directly impeaching his earlier testimony. But the existence of the tapes and the knowledge of their contents hung over the trial.
And Furman's reaction.
When the defense recalled him to the stand after the tape surfaced, he walked in, was asked by Cochran, "Detective Furman, did you plant or manufacture any evidence in this case?" And Furman repeatedly invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination.
Which sounds like.
To many, it sounded like an admission of guilt, or at least that he couldn't deny it under oath without perjuring himself further or incriminating himself. It destroyed his credibility.
How did the prosecution handle the Furman fallout?
In their closing arguments, they had to acknowledge Furman was a racist, a liar. Marcia Clark called him a bad cop, but argued the jury shouldn't throw out all the other evidence, the DNA, the timeline, the history of abuse just because of him. They tried to distance the core evidence from Furman.
Did Furman face consequences?
Yes. After the criminal trial, he was charged with perjury for lying under oath about the racial slurs. He pleaded no contest.
Okay, let's talk about the gloves one more time. The centerpiece, in many ways.
Absolutely. One dark, expensive Eris leather glove at the Bundy scene, its mate found behind Cato Kaelin's guest house at Rockingham.
Where Kaelin heard the thumps.
Exactly. The prosecution established Nicole had bought Simpson 2 pairs of those exact gloves back in 1990.
And the DNA.
As mentioned, the prosecution argued both gloves contained incriminating DNA. The Bundy glove, mixture of Simpson, Brown, Goldman. The Rockingham glove, Goldman's blood, plus hairs consistent with both victims and Simpson.
Then came the infamous demonstration, June 15th, 1995.
One of the most memorable moments of the trial, Johnny Cochran, during cross-examination of a glove expert, dramatically asked the judge if Simpson could try on the glove found at Bundy.
Did the prosecution object?
Initially, yes. Darden argued the glove had been soaked in blood, frozen and thawed multiple times for testing, and Simpson was wearing latex gloves underneath all factors that could affect the fit. But Judge Inoto allowed it.
And Simpson tries it on.
In front of the jury, cameras rolling, he visibly struggled, grimaced, couldn't seem to pull the glove fully onto his hand. It looked way too tight.
Leading to the famous line.
Defense attorney Gerald Uhlman supposedly whispered the line to Cochran, who then used it powerfully in his closing argument. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. It became the defense's rallying cry.
Did the prosecution have an explanation for why it didn't seem to fit?
They tried. Darden later raised concerns that Simpson might have deliberately stopped taking his arthritis medication, causing his hands to swell. They also argued the glove could have shrunk from moisture and testing. They even produced a photo of Simpson wearing what looked like identical gloves at a football game years earlier, fitting perfectly then.
What was the theory about how Simpson's blood got on the glove and at the scene?
The prosecution pointed to cuts observed on Simpson's left middle finger the day after the murders. Their theory was he cut himself during the struggle, possibly while attacking Goldman, dripping blood at the scene and onto the glove.
Defense counter.
They argued neither glove showed any cuts that would correspond to Simpson's injury. They also pointed out that witnesses like the limo driver and flight attendants hadn't noticed any cuts or bandages on Simpson's hands right after the murders allegedly occurred. And of course, they kept coming back to Furman planting the Rockingham glove.
Was the hair evidence on the gloves definitive?
Not entirely. Hair analysis can show consistency, but it's not like DNA fingerprinting. It added to the picture, but wasn't absolute proof on its own.
Did the prosecution counter the planting theory regarding the glove discovery?
They emphasized that the Bundy crime scene had already been processed for about 2 hours before Furman even went over to Rockingham. If the killer had dropped both gloves at Bundy, wouldn't the first officers have found both? Why would one mysteriously appear at Rockingham later?
And Furman denied planting it initially?
Yes. Before the tape surfaced, he denied it. Afterwards, he took the fifth. Years later, Chris Darden wrote in a book that he suspected Cochran had tampered with the glove's lining to make it harder to put on, a claim Dershowitz vehemently denied. Darden also later said he thought the gloves did fit and Simpson was just acting.
So much conflicting information for the jury. Then, closing arguments.
The final pitches. Darden went first for the prosecution, ridiculing the defense's conspiracy theory. He asked if the LAPD was so determined to frame Simpson, why didn't they arrest him for the 1989 domestic violence incident? Why wait for a double murder?
And Cochran's closing.
It was legendary, masterful theater. He focused heavily on Furman, calling him a lying, perjuring, genocidal racist. He compared him to Hitler. He urged the jury, particularly the black jurors, to see the case as a larger fight against police corruption and racism. Send them a message, he implored.
Powerful stuff, especially given the context of LA at the time.
Absolutely. The city was still healing from the 1992 riots after the Rodney King verdict. There were palpable fears that a guilty verdict for Simpson could trigger similar unrest. Security around the courthouse was intense.
And then the verdict.
October 3rd, 1995. Just before 10 a.m. Pacific time, the foreman handed the verdicts to the clerk.
And the finding was?
Not guilty on both counts of murder.
How long did the jury deliberate?
Shockingly fast. They reportedly reached their decision in less than 4 hours the previous afternoon, October 2nd. Judge Ito delayed the announcement until the next morning to allow attorneys and families time to get there.
Did they review much testimony?
Reports indicate the only testimony they asked to review was Alan Parks, the limo driver, specifically about when he arrived and didn't see the Bronco.
The reaction must have been immense.
Immense doesn't even cover it. An estimated 100 million people worldwide stopped what they were doing to watch or listen to the verdict live. Long-distance call volume plummeted. Trading on the New York Stock Exchange slowed dramatically. Water usage dropped as people avoided bathroom breaks. Even a Supreme Court oral argument was interrupted with the news.
Moment frozen in time.
Truly. The differing reactions, often visibly split along racial lines, spoke volumes about the different perspectives on the justice system, policing, and celebrity in America. Jurors later said they had reasonable doubts, particularly about the evidence handling and Furman's role. But the debate, the obsession, it never really ended.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Case. Don't forget to subscribe and see you next time.